The bleach is under the sink if you need to wash up.
In the dead of night, the Neon Spoon Diner was less of an eatery and more of a purgatory for the lost and the exhausted. Olivia Brown didn't mind the silence. She preferred the hum of the industrial refrigerator to the noise of a world that never seemed to have a place for her. As a black woman in the heart of a gritty district, she had learned that being invisible was a survival skill. But every night at 3 a.m., the bell above the door would chime, and the Ghost of Seoul would walk in, shattering her anonymity without saying a single word. Min-kyu was a man made of sharp angles and expensive shadows. He always took the corner booth, the one that allowed him to see both the front entrance and the kitchen exit. He was the kind of dangerous that didn't need to bark. He just existed, and the air in the room got thinner. Olivia would walk over, her mahogany skin glowing under the buzzing pink neon sign, and pour his black coffee. She never asked him for his order, and he never looked at the menu. The obsession started with a glance. One night, as the coffee swirled into his cup, Olivia noticed the cuff of his charcoal sleeve was damp, not with rain, but with something thicker, darker. Her hand didn't shake. She simply reached into her apron, pulled out a stack of extra napkins, and placed them quietly beside his saucer. "The bleach is under the sink if you need to wash up," she murmured, her voice a low, grounded honey that seemed to pull Min-kyu out of his icy trance. For the first time in months, Min-kyu looked up. His eyes weren't just dark, they were a void, obsidian and unreadable. He watched the way the neon light danced off Olivia's cheekbones, noting the calm defiance in her amber gaze. Most people would have called the police or fainted. She had offered him cleaning supplies. "Why aren't you afraid, Olivia Brown?" His voice a gravelly rasp she hadn't heard before. The fact that he knew her name, read from a cheap plastic badge, sent a shiver down her spine that wasn't entirely about fear. "Fear doesn't pay my rent, Mr. Kang," she replied, turning back to the counter. She didn't see the way his eyes tracked the sway of her hips, or the way his hand tightened around the coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. Min-kyu didn't just want a witness to his darkness. He wanted the only woman who could look at it and not blink. The back of the Neon Spoon opened into a narrow alleyway where the city's filtered moonlight struggled to reach the pavement. Olivia stepped out, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind her, cutting off the comforting hum of the diner. She was just there to dump a bag of coffee grounds, a mundane task for a woman who lived a mundane life. But as she tossed the bag into the industrial bin, a sharp, wet sound echoed off the brick walls. A sound like a heavy rug being beaten against stone. She froze. 10 feet away, bathed in the sickly green light of a flickering street lamp, stood Min-kyu. The Ghost of Seoul was no longer a silent customer in a booth. He was a storm of violence. He held a man by the collar of a leather jacket, his knuckles landing with a rhythmic, brutal precision. Beside them, 2 other men lay motionless on the wet asphalt. Olivia's breath hitched, a small, visible puff of white in the cold air. She should have run. She should have slipped back inside and bolted the door. But then, Min-kyu dropped the man and turned. His face was splattered with a fine mist of crimson, his obsidian eyes wide with the adrenaline of the kill. He looked feral, a predator caught in the middle of a feast. When his gaze landed on Olivia, his entire body went still. He didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his waistband. He didn't move to silence the witness. Instead, he stared at her with a terrifying, hungry intensity, not because she had seen his crime, but because she was seeing him. The blood on his face stood out in stark contrast to his pale skin, but it was the way it looked against the backdrop of Olivia's deep mahogany complexion that seemed to transfix him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Olivia finally spoke, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "You're bleeding again, Mr. Kang." A slow, chilling smile spread across Min-kyu's face. It wasn't a smile of relief. It was the look of a man who had finally found the missing piece of a dark puzzle. He took a step toward her, his shoes crunching on broken glass. "You have a habit of noticing things you shouldn't, Olivia Brown," he rasped, his voice vibrating in the narrow space. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, his fingers stained with the life of his enemies. "And now that you've seen the ghost, I can't let you go back to the light." The following night, the neon spoon felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of stale grease and the impending sense of an ending. Olivia wiped the counter with a shaking hand, her eyes darting to the clock every few seconds. 3 a.m. came and went, then 3:15. The bell didn't chime. The silence was louder than any scream, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of her lungs. She retreated to the break room, a cramped closet of a space filled with lockers and a flickering fluorescent bulb. She leaned her head against the cool metal of her locker, closing her eyes, trying to convince herself that the alleyway had been a hallucination born of exhaustion. "You're late with the coffee, Olivia." The voice didn't come from the door. It came from the corner, where the shadows were deepest. Olivia bolted upright, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Min-kyu was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over a fresh, charcoal-colored suit. He looked pristine, the violence of the previous night scrubbed away, replaced by an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. "How did you get in here?" she breathed, her hand reaching for the heavy stapler on the table, a pathetic weapon against a man who moved like smoke. "I own the building now," he said simply, stepping into the light. The fluorescent hum seemed to buzz louder as he approached. "I own the street. I own the air you're breathing." He stopped inches from her, his presence an invisible weight that pinned her in place. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers tracing the edge of her name tag. "You saw what I am, Olivia. In my world, a witness is a loose thread, and I don't like my designs to unravel." "I won't say anything," she whispered, her amber eyes locked on his. "I don't care about your business. I just want to work." "You don't understand," Min-kyu murmured, his gaze dropping to the pulse leaping in her throat. His obsession wasn't a slow burn. It was a flash fire. He didn't want her silence. He wanted her proximity. "You've spent your life being invisible, hoping the world wouldn't notice you. But I noticed. I've been noticing for months. The way you take your tea, the way you hum when you think no one is listening. You aren't going back to that counter." He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, the scent of his expensive cologne and cold rain enveloping her. "You have two choices. You can walk out that door and wait for my enemies to find the girl who saw the ghost, or you can come with me, and I will make sure the world never touches you again." "And the price?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "The price," he rasped, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, "is that you never look at another man the way you looked at me in that alley." The estate sat atop a jagged cliff on the outskirts of the city, a brutalist monument of glass and black basalt that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. When the heavy iron gates hissed shut behind them, Olivia felt the final thread of her old life snap. She stood in the center of a foyer so vast it could have swallowed the neon spoon whole. The floor was a dark, polished obsidian that mirrored her every movement, making it feel as though she were walking on the surface of a deep, midnight lake. "This is your new world, Olivia," Min-kyu said, his voice echoing in the hollow expanse. He didn't look at her. He was busy handing his coat to a silent man in a suit, but his attention was entirely focused on her reflection in the glass. He led her up a spiral staircase to a suite that overlooked the churning sea. It was a masterpiece of cold luxury. The walls were draped in heavy charcoal velvet, and the bed was a massive island of white silk. But it was the wardrobe that stopped her breath. He opened the doors to reveal rows of dresses in colors she had never dared to wear: burnt orange, deep gold, and the exact shade of emerald that made her mahogany skin look like a royal treasure. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Kang," Olivia said, her voice small against the grandeur. "I don't belong in silk." Min-kyu turned, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "You were a waitress. Now you are a secret. My secret." He reached out, his fingers catching a lock of her hair, twining it around his thumb with a slow, meditative possessiveness. "At the diner, you were a shadow in the corner. Here, you are the only thing I care to see. I didn't bring you here to serve me, Olivia. I brought you here so I could watch you exist in a place where no one else can touch you." He moved closer, his heat radiating through the thin fabric of her old uniform. He began to unbutton the cheap polyester shirt, his eyes locked on hers with a gaze so intense it felt like a brand. "Every night I sat in that booth, I imagined taking this off you," he confessed, his voice dropping to a low, jagged rasp. "I imagined what it would be like to see you against my sheets, away from the grease and the neon. You think this is a prison, Olivia, but soon you'll realize it's the only place you've ever been truly seen." As the uniform fell to the floor, leaving her in the moonlight, Olivia realized the Ghost of Seoul hadn't just saved her from his enemies. He had hunted her, waited for her, and finally trapped her in a gilded watchtower where he was the only guard. The storm that had been brewing in Min-kyu's eyes for months finally broke on a Tuesday. He returned to the estate long after midnight, the scent of ozone and iron clinging to his skin like a shroud. He didn't go to his wing of the house. Instead, he moved through the darkened hallways toward Olivia's suite, his footsteps heavy with a rare, jagged lack of composure. Olivia was awake, sitting by the window in a slip of champagne-colored silk that glowed against the deep mahogany of her shoulders. When the door swung open, she didn't jump. She had learned the rhythm of his arrival, the way the air in the room seemed to vibrate just before he appeared. But tonight was different. His tie was gone, his shirt was torn at the shoulder, and his knuckles were freshly bruised. The ghost had been forced into the light. "You're hurt," she whispered, rising from the chair. "Don't," he rasped, the word a warning and a plea. He leaned against the doorframe, his chest heaving. "I told you to stay in the dark, Olivia. I told myself I could keep you here like a statue in a gallery, untouched, silent." He crossed the room in 3 predatory strides, his hands slamming onto the back of her chair, pinning her between his arms. The coldness that usually defined him had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, simmering heat. "But I can't stop thinking about the way you looked at me in that alley. You didn't look at the blood. You looked at me, and it's making me lose my mind." Olivia reached up, her hand hesitant before she pressed her palm against his cheek. His skin was freezing, but his gaze was a wildfire. "I'm not a statue, Min-kyu, and I'm not a secret you can just keep in a box." That was the snap. The sound of his restraint shattering was almost audible. A low, tortured sound, and buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. I've spent every night since that first cup of coffee trying not to take you, trying to be the man who protects you instead of the monster who ruins you. He pulled back, his obsidian eyes scanning her face with a terrifying, desperate hunger. His thumb traced her lower lip, pulling it down just enough to see the flash of her teeth. But I'm tired of being the ghost. Tonight, I want to be the man who owns you. He didn't wait for her to agree. He claimed her mouth with a brutal, starving intensity, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her body flush against his. In the silence of the fortress, the power shifted. He wasn't just her captor anymore. He was a man surrendering to his only obsession. The sanctuary was breached at the hour when the tide was highest. Min-kyu had been called away to a summit of the 5 families, leaving Olivia in the care of his elite guard. But the ghost's enemies had realized that he no longer moved like a phantom. He was anchored to a single point of light in a glass house. Olivia was in the library when the glass shattered. It wasn't the clean break of a stone, but the tactical breach of men who had been paid more than their lives were worth. She didn't scream. The survival instincts honed in the grit of the neon spoon took over. She ducked behind the heavy oak desk just as the first rounds of suppressed gunfire hissed through the air, shredding the velvet curtains she had come to love. "Take her alive!" a voice barked. "She's the only leverage that will make him bleed." Olivia felt a cold, sharp anger override her terror. They didn't see a woman. They saw a pawn. She grabbed a heavy, decorative bronze bust from the desk and waited. When the first shadow rounded the corner, she swung with every ounce of strength she possessed, the metal connecting with a sickening crack. But there were too many. A rough hand grabbed her by the hair, dragging her toward the broken window. Then, the world turned red. The heavy oak doors of the library didn't open. They exploded off their hinges. Min-kyu stepped through the dust and splinters, his tuxedo shirt stark white against the darkness of his rage. He didn't use a gun. He moved with a terrifying liquid speed, a blade appearing in his hand as he tore through the intruders with the precision of a butcher. He wasn't just defending his home, he was purifying it. When he reached the man holding Olivia, Min-kyu didn't stop. He dropped his weapon and used his bare hands, his face a mask of such absolute demonic fury that even the dying men on the floor tried to crawl away. He slammed the attacker against the stone fireplace, his fingers tightening around the man's throat until the struggle ceased. He turned to Olivia, his chest heaving, his obsidian eyes scanning her for a single scratch. When he saw the red mark on her scalp where she'd been pulled, a low, guttural roar escaped him. He scooped her into his arms, crushing her against his blood-stained chest. "I told them," he hissed into her hair, his body vibrating with a lethal tremor. "I told them that you were the one thing they couldn't touch. Now, I have to burn the city so they never forget." The charred remains of the neon spoon stood as a skeletal warning to the rest of the city. Min-kyu hadn't just burned his enemies. He had burned the bridge to Olivia's past. He led her through the yellow police tape, his hand a permanent fixture at the small of her back. The interior smelled of ash and melted plastic. The neon sign that once buzzed over her head, now a jagged piece of dead glass on the floor. He led her to the very booth where he had sat for months, the only piece of furniture he had ordered his men to save from the fire. He sat her down and, for the first time, He went behind the counter. The Ghost of Seoul picked up a pristine white ceramic cup, one he had brought from the estate, and poured a dark, steaming liquid from a thermos. He placed it in front of her. No more cheap porcelain, no more chipped edges. "I bought the block, Olivia," he said, his voice echoing in the hollowed-out ruins. "Every brick, every memory of you being invisible is gone. There is no more waiting for the 3 a.m. regular. There is no more hiding behind a badge." Olivia looked at the coffee, then up at the man who had systematically destroyed her world just to build a new one around her. The fear was gone, replaced by a heavy, soul-deep realization. She was the center of his dark universe. "You didn't just want to save me," she murmured, her amber eyes reflecting the dawn light breaking through the scorched windows. "You wanted to ensure there was nowhere else for me to go." Min-kyu knelt before her, his hands, the hands that had ended lives to keep her breathing, resting on her knees. "I want you to be the only thing that remains when the world burns. You saw the ghost, Olivia, and the ghost doesn't let go." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, the diamond as black and deep as his own obsession. He didn't ask a question. He made a decree. He slipped it onto her finger, the cold metal a final, beautiful shackle. "The waitress is dead," he whispered, kissing her knuckles. "And the queen has no need for a diner." As they walked out of the ruins and into the waiting black sedan, Olivia didn't look back. The midnight obsession was no longer a secret kept in the shadows. It was a permanent reign. The story of Olivia Brown and the Ghost of Seoul didn't end in a goodbye. It ended in a total, irrevocable surrender.